Okay, welcome to the Rouge Pack Saturday night class with Ben Deniston. This is Tony Pappert. Ben is standing by. Tonight, we're going to discuss one of the secrets of the Biden inflation, which is crushing American families. It can be shown, and I can do it during the Q&A if you like, that the inflation, which is crushing our wage earners, is at least triple the official recorded amount of inflation. And the Federal Reserve is too stupid to understand this, but many housewives do. Where the Bureau of Labor Statistics says inflation is at 3.4%, you should read that instead at 10.2%. And so the average real wage and also average real income, instead of slowly drifting down right now under Biden, is plummeting with inflation at 10.2% or more, despite all that they're saying. And one of the secrets of this, which again, the Fed is too stupid to understand, but you, the citizen, can understand it. And by the end of the tonight, within the next hour, you will understand how one of the causes of this inflation is the green energy policy. I mean, President Trump rightly points to this, but he doesn't point to the causes underlying it. And this is what Ben is going to do. So, tonight we're going to give you one of the keys by which the United States can emerge from under this economic burial wreckage under a second term of President Trump. So with that, let me pass it over to Ben.
Thanks, Tony. Glad to be on. So this should be interesting. Like Tony said, we want to discuss, this green energy issue. I think this is useful. I think in two ways. Tony just said very clearly that, and we'll get into the energy costs, the price of energy, the physical costs of producing energy itself is a major component driving the inflation. I think the other thing, hopefully, that will come across in the discussion tonight is that economics in general is ultimately, fundamentally, a physical process. And that's not something that's, I think, commonly discussed enough. So much of economics, as it's popularly discussed or academically discussed, comes around money, monetary theory, very monetary heavy metrics. And what's not understood enough is that ultimately, really, it's a physical process of how mankind's improving or not improving his power over nature, right? That's really what you're talking about with economics. So, we've got a big job ahead of us educating the American people and our leadership on some of these deeper issues. There's a lot of recognition, I think, now between what Trump's done, what the MAGA movement has done, what other patriots have done, understanding that this green stuff's really a scam. But hopefully this will be a good example of how we need to think about economics more generally. So I want to look at the green energy issue as I guess I'd call it a case study in real economics. And so we'll pick apart, we'll break down this whole green energy idea in a couple successive layers of getting deeper into the issue. Now, the first layer I want to start with, I'm going to share my screen here. Just find it right. So the first thing I want to touch on is what I guess you could really call the shadow of the deeper physical cause, which is the fact that anywhere that's really gone heavily investing in green energy, and we'll focus on wind and solar as the primary energy sources of so-called green energy. Anywhere that's heavily invested and really gone with this whole green energy policy, wind, solar policy, we're going to get rid of all fossil fuels. We're going to get rid of nuclear. We're going to get rid of hydro. We're going to go, wind and solar is the predominant premier supposedly renewable, supposedly green future energy policies. Anywhere that's done that has seen dramatic rises in energy costs, right? And so this is a statistic that was produced a couple of years ago. I like it a lot. I think it shows the issue pretty clearly. But there's plenty of other studies out there, but this one shows a direct comparison between nations throughout Europe. And what's the relation between two factors, right? One factor, what's your energy and solar energy generation, or wind and solar energy generation per capita, right? So per person, how much wind and solar do you have in your country? Compared against the other factor, what's your cost of electricity? And you see a very clear systemic relationship, right? The more wind and solar you have per capita in your country, the higher your electricity costs, right? It's pretty clear, right? Places that go heavily, all the way from, all the way up to Germany and Denmark, we see here leading the way. And this is before all the Ukraine war and Russian gas, which being cut off, and all that has had obviously the whole Ukraine war and Russian situation has completely, put the European energy sector through more chaos. But this is before that. This is years before even that got going. So even that aside, we see, nations like Germany, Denmark that have just pushed and led the way over the last 20 years, really, in implementing more and more wind and solar, have, now as a result of that, all that work, the highest electricity costs. We can look to the United States also. This is another useful comparison. We look at here just a decade, 2010 to 2020, 2011 to 2020. And you compare the rise of electricity prices in California versus the rest of the country combined. And we can see that electricity prices have been relatively stable around the rest of the country. But California, which I think most people know, has been a major proponent of wind, solar, this whole green energy craziness, have seen prices rise at a rate 7 times higher than the rest of the country, right? So before we looked at Europe, nation by nation, here we're looking at the United States, state by state, and we take California as a nice, useful example. Tragic, sad, but illustrative that a state that pushes this mandates for green energy, shutting down fossil fuels, not heavily investing in nuclear and so on, is suffering the effect of higher costs, right? So that's, I'd say, layer one. Places that push this stuff, they pay for it, literally out of pocket with higher electricity prices. But why is that? Again, costs, how much something costs, the monetary value, these are really shadows of the actual underlying economic process. And with energy, and green energy in particular, let's go to first principles. Let's go to the fundamental, unchangeable, underlying physical reality behind green energy, right? And I think this is incredibly important because even with what we just discussed, the higher electricity costs for places that are pushing green energy, wind and solar, the higher costs of wind and solar, people still might say, oh, but the technology could get better. We could get better solar panels. We can get better windmills. The technology is improving. There is a boundary condition, a physical underlying reality that cannot be changed by any technological innovation. And that is the source of the energy. And with wind and solar, you're inherently talking about low energy density or low energy flux density sources of power, right? What do I mean by that? Well, every day we walk around outside in the sunlight, exposed to the wind, and we have no problem doing that, right? have you seen what, the source of the energy for wind and solar is incredibly diffuse. It's incredibly dispersed. It's not a high intensity, right? It's why you can walk around outside in the environment, in the sources of wind and solar power and be fine, right? Maybe you get a little sunburn if you stay out there long enough, depending on where you live, right? Try going inside a coal plant or a natural gas plant and standing near the actual furnace where they're combusting the fuel to generate electricity, right? I think we can all imagine that's a far more high temperature, high intensity, high energy, and a high energy flux density process, right? So when you're generating power from coal or natural gas or nuclear power, right? The combustion process, the initial sources, the source of the energy that you're harvesting is of a much higher intensity, right? That's not the case with wind and solar, right? There's nothing we can do to change that. You're not going to move the Earth closer to the sun, right? You're not going to change how much solar energy is reaching the Earth's surface. That's a condition that's a factor that we have no control over, right? That is what it is. And compared to any other modern source of generating power for society today, it is an incredibly low energy flux density. Same with wind, right? So those are first principles. And they're also not consistent, right? The sunlight, obviously half the day you don't have any sunlight, right? Wind fluctuates, it goes up, it goes down. So it's also very inconsistent and intermittent. So, you have to deal with that whole factor, those factors, right? Which make it even more less cost effective. So again, no technological advances are going to change that and make these viable options. So what does that mean? You have a low source of energy you're starting from. You're starting from an incredibly low energy flux density source, which means you need to use much more territory. You got to cover vastly larger amounts of territory to capture enough energy, right? So these are quotes that come from Senate testimony from a couple years ago. Michael Schellenberger was testifying before the Senate on the issues of green energy. And, he reported industrial solar and wind projects require between 300 to 400 times more land area than nuclear plants, right? 300 to 400 times more land use required by wind and solar compared to nuclear plants to generate the same amount of electricity, right? Again, it's a low energy flux density source. There's nothing you can do other than cover vast territories of windmills and solar panels to try and capture that energy. This Senate testimony, he also said, if the United States were to try and generate all of the energy it uses with renewables, 25% to 50% of the entire land area of our country would be required, right? Completely absurd. On the other hand, if we were to go with nuclear power, you need 0.5% of the total land area of the United States to provide all the energy we need in our country. So you have, 100 plus times the larger land areas required to capture the energy, to deal with the intermittent issues and the inconsistency. You need these complex smart grids. You got to transfer the energy all around the country. If the wind's not blowing in one place, you got to transfer energy there from somewhere else. If it's cloudy, you got to deal with that. If you have you have these highly complex smart grids to try and transport the energy all around, and then you need to store the energy, right? Energy storage is a huge issue. On scales of cities, states, economies, it is a massive issue with huge cost to try and have any kind of slightly significant energy storage on those scales. It's a massive issue. So these factors, right, these first principal factors that we cannot change mean physically, for physical reasons, there's no getting around the fact that wind and solar are always going to be a significant, massively higher cost, more expensive source of energy. So that's on the side of land use. But then, what do we actually need to cover the land with to generate, to capture energy through wind and solar sources of power? Well, you need to build the solar panels, you need to build the windmills, right? So this is another study I think is very interesting from a U.S. government report from a few years ago, where they compared different methods of generating electricity: coal power plants, natural gas plants, nuclear plants, wind, windmills, and solar panels. And they looked at what's the total physical goods input required to generate the same unit amount of electricity over the life cycle of those different modes of generating electricity. So this is a really useful way to compare these things apples to apples, right? To generate just say 1 megawatt hour of electricity by coal versus natural gas versus nuclear versus wind versus solar, you can quantify that in terms of how much material input is required to build the facilities to capture that electricity, right? And we can see here very clearly, you look at things like glass inputs, concrete, cement, copper, steel, aluminum. You take all these main, physical inputs required, and you compare these systems by looking at how much of those inputs are needed, and we see that wind is 11 times the material cost of nuclear, and solar is 16 times the material cost of solar, right? So again, pretty, somewhat obvious from what we were just looking at in terms of land use, right? The inherently low energy flux density of wind and solar means you need to cover vast territories with physical systems, windmills, solar panels. You got to build them, you got to construct them, you got to maintain them, you got to replace them when they reach the end of their life cycle, right? So, the physical costs of wind and solar are massive. So what does that mean for the actual economy today? Well, you go back and you look at what Biden was pushing. Honestly, I don't know the status of this. Obviously the best way we can ensure that no policies like this get implemented is by getting Trump reelected. But you look at what Biden was pushing, right? This is California is talking about this. Certain nations in Europe have been talking about this. Obviously, these big globalist institutions, are pushing these kinds of initiatives to say, full CO2 free electricity by 2035, 2040, 2050, these kinds of targets, right? So you just take an example of this kind of policy. What would this mean? What would this actually mean for the U.S. economy if we were to try and do this, right? So take this, what Biden put forward in 2021, 100% CO2 free electricity by 2035, 50% reduction from 2005 levels of greenhouse gas by 2030. Those are some benchmark things we can reference. So let's take then what we know about the material costs of wind and solar, and what it would look like physically, what we would have to build, what we'd have to put into it to achieve these goals. And this is a breakdown I did based on the figures we've been looking at so far. I made this a couple years ago. Now, to break down what we're looking at here, the bottom axis is time, right? So we're going from the year 2000 up to this 2035 goal that the Biden administration talked about, right? So that's our time axis on the bottom. The colored in areas, the red, the blue, and the orange, those are total tons of material required in the electricity sector, in the energy sector, to produce the energy for the economy, right? So how much concrete basically gets consumed annually, how much steel and how much of the other material inputs needed to generate electricity gets consumed annually to produce the electricity for the economy, right? As we can see, as you'd expect, if you're paying attention to what we just went through, right? Obviously, if we were to implement Biden's program, right? This is assuming Biden's program gets pushed through. You'd have a massive, massive increase in the physical cost to generate electricity, right? It requires, again, massive more tons of steel, concrete, aluminum, all your material inputs to build and maintain your power generation systems are way higher, an order of magnitude higher when you go with wind and solar. So if you look at that in totality, in the context of the actual US economy, this is what it would look like. A massive, massive increase year over year over year in the physical inputs, physical cost to generate electricity. And if you see on this graph, there's one other factor on here, right? Which is that blue line with the dots on it. That's the actual total electricity generated year over year, right? So how does that look? Right? What does that, what impression does that give you right there, right? What is the total electricity doing in this graph? It's not changing. It's staying flat. And yet the physical costs are skyrocketing, right? So you want to talk about inflation, something like inflation. Well, these are the kinds of physical processes that underlie, that really cause phenomenon in the economy like inflation, right? And I think that's so important to stress because so often we just hear about it from the monetary side, right? The government's printing money, the Fed's printing money, they're just circulating money into the economy. The more money you circulate, it's going to drive inflation. There's truth to that, absolutely, but that's not the full picture, right? You have the physical reality side. If the government were generating money, but that money was going into generating and implementing more advanced technologies that increase the productive powers of labor, you can have an expansion of the monetary supply that does not generate inflation, something Mr. LaRouche talked about a lot, right? Here, or you could have, a tight monetary policy, not increasing the monetary supply, but investing in lower technologies that increase the physical costs required to produce the same thing, the same goods for society, which can drive inflation, right? So, because your physical costs are going. So this is, I just think, an incredibly important example for the way we need to, as we're preparing people to implement the policies needed to save this country and turn this country around. These are the kind of things we really need to better understand. So this is the physical reality of Biden's and any green energy program. Massively increase the physical costs to get the same result, right? And in reality, this probably wouldn't even be able to happen because the economy would go into a collapse phase, right? But this is just, modeling out what it would look like under Biden's program. And to step back, really this is going against the natural order of the universe as we know it. This would be stepping backwards. What we're looking at here is a study from a few years ago, which I think is pretty interesting. It's picking up off of. I don't think the author was familiar with Mr. LaRouche's work, Lyndon LaRouche's work on physical economics and energy flux density, but it certainly is supportive of the work Mr. LaRouche was doing even earlier than when this study was done. But what we're looking at here is indications that increasing intensity of energy use in a system, right? Energy flux density, increasing energy flux density throughout the universe is consistently a metric, if not the metric, of progress, of development. If you look at how galaxies evolve, from dwarf galaxies into more complex forms, into highly structured things like spiral galaxies and large developed elliptical galaxies, right? Throughout the vast scope of the universe, as galaxies evolve and develop and get more complex, that's measured by the increasing energy flux density of these galactic systems as a whole. Stars within those galaxies, from our sun to any other type of star, the evolution of a star, the life cycle of a star, is itself measured by increasing energy flux density. The evolution of life on Earth, from the dominance of single-celled forms of life up through the Cambrian explosion and the emergence of the more modern diversity of the kind of the modern kingdoms we see with animal life and plant life, through the things like the so-called age of the amphibians, into the age of the reptiles, the age of the dinosaurs, into the age of the mammals, right? All those steps and stages in the evolution of life and the development of life and the progress of life, and life becoming more and more powerful on this planet, shaping the planet in increasing dimensions to increasing degrees, is measured also by increasing energy flux density. Human progress, the progress of human society, from the earliest signs we have of mankind controlling fire for the first time and using it to his advantage, through successive stages of the development of human societies, increasing energy flux density. That's the metric for progress. So green is backwards. Green is death. Green is suicide for any society. What they call green today: wind, solar, taking a modern society that's built up on much higher energy density sources of power and trying to support that and sustain that on a massively lower energy flux density base of energy, wind and solar, is the destruction of any economy that tries to do it, and is really going against the natural order of the universe as we know it, in any form we look at it. And I want to conclude by just looking back now again at the United States from this standpoint. So this is something I study, I've developed, kind of used for a number of years. I think it's incredibly useful now looking at the history of the United States from this standpoint. And on the bottom axis, we have the history of the United States from 1776 up to today. And what we're looking at is the energy consumption per capita, the energy consumption per person, in terms of different sources of energy. So we're starting off from the founding of our country here up through about 1850, looking at the energy consumption per person using wood, biomass, as the source of energy. And we can see that was, up through the mid-late 1800s, the primary source of energy. And then it tailed off and diminished. And what do we see that took its place? Coal. Now, coal has a higher energy density as a fuel source, about 50% higher. So to generate the same amount of energy using coal requires less coal by weight, right? It's significantly more energy dense, providing all kinds of benefits. And as we can see, not only is coal itself a higher energy dense source of fuel, but it enabled the energy consumption per capita, per person, or what I would call the energy flux density of the economy as a totality, to increase. Let's look at that further. Coal itself then went through a decline. Well, we can see because it was largely, significantly replaced, not completely, but largely replaced by petroleum and natural gas, right? But oil and natural gas themselves are higher, now an even higher energy density, right? Around twice the energy density of coal, 3 times the energy density of wood. So again, per weight of the fuel, for the same weight, a pound of the fuel, right? You get now significantly more energy comes out of that 1 pound of fuel. And again, utilizing that higher energy density source of fuel allowed the economy as a totality to increase its energy flux density. The energy consumption per person per capita throughout the economy rose even higher as we shifted to these more energy dense sources of fuel, right? So this is the United States, it's the history of the United States itself mirroring, reflecting what we saw in that grand scale of the universe, from galaxies to stars to life to human beings, right? We see that kind of progressive development in terms of energy flux density now expressed in the history of the United States itself, which I think is really remarkable. And we see, if we continue the actual historical study, we see that oil and natural gas began to decline. And what we see here is nuclear fission power on top of this. But this is not actually what happened in terms of how much nuclear power was developed. This is the forecast, the expectation by the John F. Kennedy administration for what the US economy would look like up through the year 2000 and beyond. And if we had followed that policy expectation in the early and mid 60s, this is what the economy would look like roughly today in terms of power consumption per capita, right? Just perfectly continuing the successive trend, right? And nuclear power is vastly, it's not, now you're talking about hundreds of thousands, potentially a million times higher energy density. It's really an incredible shift. Nuclear fission fuel and nuclear fusion fuel, even better, has a vastly higher energy density. So, 1 pound of uranium fuel has something like, over 100,000 times the energy than a pound of oil or petroleum or natural gas or something like that. So, nuclear is an incredible shift. And in the 60s, it was expected that, following this historical natural trend of upward development, successive waves of higher energy flux density modes for the economy powered by these more energy dense fuel sources, this is what it was expected to happen. Unfortunately, it didn't. And the reason it didn't wasn't because anything about nuclear power, it wasn't because anything about wind or solar per se. It wasn't like those were better options. We, clearly showed they're not. The United States went into a post-industrial policy. We went with this whole globalization nonsense where we shut down industry. We said, let's just have poor people around the world build our goods in terrible conditions, and we won't produce them here. That wasn't the sentiment of the whole U.S. population, but that was the sentiment of clearly certain elites that shifted the U.S. policy increasingly over the last 2 generations into this crazy globalist program. So we see, really almost 2 generations now of a flat line and lack of growth, and now beginning decline in the total energy flux density of our economy as a totality, as a function of these policies. And if we zoom in on this period here, we can see that the biggest, basically the primary sole major factor for this flat line and decline in the energy flux density of the economy, of the US economy as a totality, is the collapse of industry. And we can see that the percentage of energy consumption for the industrial sector has collapsed from nearly 50% to less than a third. And, I think Tony would tell you, even this is skewed because they changed what they classify as industry, right? So, a lot of things that are classified more recently as supposed industry, we might not want to even consider industry. So actual, production might even be less than this. And it's gotten so bad that, over the last 10 years, the amount of energy the amount of energy that should be going into industrial production, but it's not, right? You could say the energy consumption that we are not doing because of all this outsourcing and lack of production, right? The gap of energy consumption needed to sustain a modern industrial economy is now greater than the total energy consumption by the residential or commercial sectors by themselves, right? Which I find incredible, right? If we were to have continued to have the same relative proportion of our total energy consumption going into industry, which would mean obviously we're producing things here that we need. We're not just relying on this whole globalization model to have poor nations produce the goods we need and just consume them and have this supposed farce of a consumer economy here in the United States. If we were not to have done that and we were to have sustained a modern industrial economy, the amount of energy that would be needed, the additional energy for industry that would be needed is the equivalent of the total amount of energy going into the residential and the commercial sectors currently, and for the last 10 years plus. I just find that remarkable. So
residential plus commercial. Yeah, I wasn't clear about that too. Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is what we should be shooting for, right? This is what a recovery and advancement and development of the economy would look like, right? We're not going to get rid of petroleum, oil. We're not going to get rid of natural gas. We're not going to get rid of coal, right? But we can become, less dependent on them as we shift more and more to the more advanced sources of power of nuclear fission and nuclear fusion, right? And we expand the nuclear sector dramatically as following this, what was clearly a very obvious natural historical trend of moving to higher energy density sources that drive a higher energy flux density of the economy as a whole, right? So this is what the future can look like, should look like, needs to look like, under our policy, under our program. Just get rid of all the wind and solar, get rid of the green crap, and go with primarily a massive increase of the nuclear sector. Got no problem with utilizing the existing fossil fuel sector as needed. That's going to play an important component, a role, but it'll be subsumed in the coming generation by this nuclear sector as again, the more significant factor. And just to bring this back full circle, to compare that with what we were looking at earlier, we see the exact opposite in this comparison chart, right? So if we were to take this forecast I'm laying out here of this increase up through 2050 of a nuclear economy, getting rid of wind and solar, we see that the total physical material inputs required to get us to that significantly higher energy consumption per capita, to sustain industry again, to reindustrialize the United States, to begin producing key goods here again, we can do it with actually sustaining the same level of physical goods input into sustaining the energy sector, right? The amount of steel, concrete, electronics, copper, what have you, all the physical material inputs needed to go into building and sustaining our energy generation can actually be the same, while the total energy produced can shoot upwards, right? Because we're going to a higher energy flux density source of power, right? So this is progress, and it's the exact opposite that we saw of the Biden program, where your energy consumption, your total energy consumption flatlines and your physical costs skyrocket, right? An entropic process an inflationary process, a death spiral for the economy, versus this. This is progress. This is negentropic growth, right? This is how economies actually progress and grow and life gets better for people, right? We can get, in this case, higher energy consumption, higher energy output, higher energy generation with the same level of physical good inputs, right? As a function of improving technology, going to higher technologies and higher energy flux densities, right? And that's a more universal point throughout the economy. But here we're just looking at it in the lens, in the context of energy consumption. So I hope that's useful and interesting for people. And I think we have a big job before us to further educate the American population, the MAGA movement, around some of these deeper conceptions. Because there's a lot of qualified, correct resentment towards the green program, obviously towards Biden, towards these globalists, towards the World Economic Forum, towards the IPCC, right, and these climate change fanatics. A lot of very correct opposition to that, but I'm not seeing as much understanding of what's needed on the positive side, and what real growth looks like for the economy in these terms. So hopefully that's provocative, and hopefully we can discuss it a little bit more.